today's short meditation, let us turn our pages to James chapter 3, verses 13 to 18. It says, "Who is wise and understanding among you? Let him show it by his good life, by deeds done in the humility that comes from wisdom. But if you harbor bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast about it or deny the truth. Such wisdom does not come down from heaven, but is earthly, unspiritual, of the devil. For where you have envy and selfish ambition, there you find disorder and every evil practice. But the wisdom that comes from heaven is first of all pure, then peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy and good fruit, impartial and sincere. Peacemakers who sow in peace raise a harvest of righteousness." Amen. Today we'll be looking into where does it all begin. In our day-to-day life we have bitterness and confusions and disappointments. And today we are here to find out where it all begins. And here in this book of James, we see that James is telling two kinds of wisdoms here. And especially in verse 14 to 16, if we go through, we see that how James proclaiming where it all begins. The things that discouragements and disappointments in our life. Here it all starts where envy and self-seeking exists. Here in verse 14 we see, "But if we harbor bitter envy and selfish ambition in our hearts, do not boast about it." And in verse 16 we see, "For where you have envy and selfishness, there you find disorder and evil practices." In order to avoid this, we need to look into verse 17, where he also says the second kind of wisdom that comes from heaven, not from this earthly wisdom, but the wisdom that comes from heaven, where it says it is first of all pure, and then peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy, good fruit, impartial, and sincere. Do we have these characteristics in our wisdom that we possess today? If we lack it, we need to ask God to give it to us today. In 1986, two ships collided each other in the Black Sea, and there are hundreds of passengers dead who were submerged in those ice waters and caused a lot of tragic loss of life. And it was very hectic news during that time. It was such a big disaster during that time. When the reason they found out behind that collision, it became more hardened, it became more darkened among the people because they felt so hatred. The news of that disaster which happened, the reason because it was collided, it was because by human stubbornness. Both the captains of those ships were not ready to submit, not ready to move the other way. Both were head on head. They don't want to leave. They were either waiting the other ship to leave or the other person was waiting for the other ship to leave. None from these both ships wanted to accept or live some way. They wanted him to move or he wanted him to move. And at last, nobody moved and it collided. Though those both captains were aware that both the ships are there, what is going to happen, they didn't yield to one another to submit or to move or to give way to another. They waited for the other person to move. He didn't want to take. Both of the captains were at fault at this. It was not some ship's fault or it was not some climate fault, but it was the human fault. It was because of these captains, though they could have saved those lives that day, if they have moved, they both decided not to yield to one another. Even before they realized it was very late, they could not help it because the ships were in that speed, They should have moved long back when they saw each other, but they didn't yield and the ship collided each other and a lot of people died. And there was a big tragic of life there. So the main cause was human's decision is what made that. And here we see James. According to James, we see there may be even greater disasters, greater havoc and loss can be created in human relationship. There are disasters because of calamities, natural calamities or any others, but there are more greater disaster because of human relationship with one another. Here we see in verse 14 and 16 that harboring a bitter envy and selfishness can lead to destruction. At last, we prefer to blame it on this world, whether it may be religious or political differences or whatever. But here James said the root problem is bitter envy and self-seeking in our hearts. It all starts in our hearts, in our human hearts. It's because of that envy and selfish anger or self-seeking in our own life. That is the cause which strays away the pride. Even when we see in Isaiah 14 verses 12, we see even Lucifer fell from heaven because of that, because of pride. And even we see Adam and Eve lose their innocence in Genesis 3:6, because it all started in their heart. Bitterness, that envy and self-seeking in their hearts, which starts in our hearts. But when we see all these problems, we saw the root cause. Today we are able to find the root cause. It all began where? It all began in our hearts, because it was rooted in envy and self-seeking. But what is the solution? What can be the solution? And how can we keep our selfish ambition and pride that we have in our hearts not to turn into something major destruction? Here we see that it's possible only through wisdom that draws from above, wisdom that comes from heaven. If we have this wisdom from heaven, we can avoid these calamities. We can avoid all these destructions that is happening in our human relationship. Wisdom, that which is pure, peaceable, gentle, willing to eat, and full of mercy and good fruits. That will begin to mark the beginning of the harmony with one another. More than the natural calamities, it is the human calamities that we make in our hearts with one another. Rather, we see that even Jesus says, love one another. And we need to have this wisdom in order to be able to love one another. And we need to have this wisdom from above, which is peace-loving, not hating, and which is considerate, and which is submissive, and which is good fruit. It should not be of our bad fruit, of our selfish desires, but of good fruit in helping one another, and sincere. And we see finally in verse 18, he says, peacemakers who sow in peace raise a harvest of righteousness. So let us try to seek this righteousness. Let us try to sow the peace in our hearts and in our neighbors' hearts. And let us try to reap righteousness which glorifies God rather than destructing ourselves. Let us choose to be a righteous person who glorifies God rather than destructing ourselves and one another. And there is a quote that which says, some troubles comes from wanting our own way. Other come from being allowed to have it. So let us try to put it all before God's hand. Seek His wisdom from above, not from our heart's desires, not from our selfish desires and self-seeking ways, but His holy ways, but His heavenly ways. Seeking the wisdom from above and trying to be righteous so that we can glorify His name.